From today, many Indian-made goods landing in the United States will be slapped with an extra 25% tariff.
The US imposed a 25% import tax earlier this month because of what the administration sees as an unfair trading relationship between the two. Now it's doubled the rate as punishment for buying oil from Russia.
In a shocking turn of events, the President of the United States announced he is imposing tariffs on a nation that is also a longtime ally. President Trump declared that import taxes on goods from India will surge to 50%, and he justified this drastic move by pointing to India's continued purchase of oil from Russia, despite Western sanctions on Moscow. In his reasoning, India is one of the largest buyers of Russian oil, second only to China, and he insisted America must respond to what he views as India undermining U.S. foreign policy. This abrupt trade salvo has disrupted the relationship with New Delhi and sent policymakers worldwide scrambling to assess the fallout. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, facing Trump's trade blitz, has already vowed that India will not compromise under pressure, setting the stage for a high-stakes showdown. This trade confrontation has spiraled into a nightmare scenario now unfolding for millions of Americans. In just 30 days since the tariff announcement, the United States has witnessed about $87 billion in trade partnerships evaporate as India struck back. Critical drug supply chains began to crumble, meaning families suddenly had to pay 20 to 40% more for life-saving medications. This decision from Washington triggered one of the most devastating economic backlashes in modern trade history. It is no ordinary trade dispute. It has morphed into a full-blown economic war, and everyday people are caught in the crossfire. Households nationwide are already experiencing the shock. Products that once were affordable have suddenly become expensive, and even basic goods are growing scarce week by week. A single stroke of his pen by President Trump has set in motion a trade backlash unlike any in recent memory. Ironically, America actually sells more to India than it buys when services are included, meaning this tariff war is undermining one of America's most lucrative trade relationships. Now, families across the nation are already bearing the price. Analysts estimate the average U.S. household will pay about $1,300 more due to this clash, and the U.S. economy could contract by up to 8%. India has responded with a systematic economic counterattack that is already reshaping global commerce. The world's largest democracy isn't blinking. In fact, what India does next could upend everything we thought we knew about international trade. On August 6, 2025, President Trump stunned observers by making what many now call the most catastrophic trade decision of his presidency. He announced that tariffs on Indian goods would double from an already steep 25% to a staggering 50%, targeting what he described as India's unfair trade practices. This wasn't just a routine trade dispute. It was effectively an economic declaration of war against a nation of 1.4 billion people that happens to be America's fourth largest trading partner. India ships nearly $87 billion in goods to the United States each year, a flow of commerce that Trump was willing to risk with a stroke of a pen. The dramatic announcement sent shockwaves through markets and left companies in both countries bracing for a punishing fallout. However, this drastic move did not emerge out of the blue. Tensions between Washington and New Delhi had been building for months over a series of strategic choices by India that the U.S. viewed with growing alarm. India was aligning itself with the BRICS bloc, an alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa that together accounts for over 40% of the world's population, and endorsing the group's push for a new gold-backed currency that could challenge the U.S. dollar's dominance. On top of that, India kept purchasing cheap oil from Russia, even as the West sanctioned Moscow for its invasion of Ukraine. To President Trump, these moves were seen as a direct threat to American influence, and he was determined to hit back hard. In fact, Trump's tariff offensive against India began even before the August 6th shocker. On August 1st, his administration quietly rolled out a blanket 25% tariff on all imports from India, invoking national security as the rationale. Unusually, this initial volley offered no exceptions, not even for crucial items like generic pharmaceuticals and electronic components that American consumers and companies rely on. It was a signal that Washington was willing to endure some self-inflicted pain to make a geopolitical point. That move on August 1st was essentially a warning shot. But when India refused to bend to U.S. demands, Trump doubled down with the far more drastic 50% tariff bombshell just days later. In Trump's eyes, India's most egregious offense was its oil trade with Russia. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, India saw an opportunity and massively increased its imports of discounted Russian crude. Before the war, Russian oil made up virtually none of India's imports. By the middle of 2025, more than a third of the oil flowing into India was coming from Russia. This provided India with cheap energy and undercut the Western sanctions aimed at Moscow. While some European countries quietly continued buying Russian fuel through back channels, Trump zeroed in on India's open dealings with Moscow as a major affront. New Delhi's reply to these accusations was firm and pragmatic. Indian officials pointed out that their Russian oil purchases were actually helping stabilize global energy prices by easing demand on other suppliers. By buying from Moscow, India reduced competition for Middle Eastern oil, the very same oil that Europe and America depend on, thus preventing worse price spikes worldwide. They also noted the apparent double standards. Many of the Western nations lecturing India were still buying Russian energy in roundabout ways themselves. India's External Affairs Ministry emphasized that securing affordable, reliable energy for India's 1.4 billion citizens is a fundamental duty of the government. By early August, neither side was willing to back down. Diplomatic talks to defuse the situation went nowhere. That's when President Trump decided to detonate his economic doomsday device, the full 50% tariff. The moment he did, decades of goodwill in U.S.-India relations went out the window. The financial markets shuddered, and pundits across the political spectrum gasped at the sheer scale of the move. It was an unprecedented salvo against a friendly nation. Economists warned that India would feel compelled to retaliate forcefully, and they were absolutely right. What few expected was the innovative and punishing manner in which India would exact its revenge. India's counterstrike was unlike the simple tit-for-tat tariffs of past trade spats. Instead, it was a masterclass in economic strategy, swift, targeted, and unrelenting. Rather than slap a mirror image tariff on American goods, New Delhi unleashed what experts described as asymmetric economic warfare. It pinpointed the most vulnerable pressure points in the American economy and struck at them with surgical precision. The objective was clear: inflict maximal pain on key U.S. industries and interests while minimizing collateral damage to India's own economy. The first blow landed on America's medicine cabinet. The United States buys about $10.5 billion worth of pharmaceutical products from India each year, roughly a third of India's total pharma exports. These medicines aren't luxury goods. They are critical generic drugs and components, antibiotics, heart medications, insulin, and more that millions of Americans rely on daily to stay healthy. In a calculated response, India imposed export restrictions on several key drug ingredients and generic medicines destined for the U.S. overnight. This created shortages for U.S. pharmaceutical suppliers and drove up drug prices. Within weeks, the cost of common medications at American pharmacies had surged by around 35%. Next, India opened a new front in the tech sector, exploiting America's dependence on Indian talent and services. India has one of the world's largest IT workforces, and major U.S. tech companies heavily rely on Indian engineers and offshore teams for their operations. In retaliation, Indian IT firms and service providers began hiking the rates they charge U.S. clients. Simultaneously, they offered discounted deals to companies in Europe and Asia to lure business away from American firms. The message to Silicon Valley was clear. If Washington was going to treat India as an economic enemy, then India's tech industry would rearrange its priorities accordingly. Then came the squeeze on American farmers. India is a huge buyer of U.S. agricultural exports from Midwestern soybeans to Great Plains wheat and corn. But faced with Trump's tariffs, Indian importers swiftly pivoted away from American produce. Large orders for U.S. grain and oilseeds were canceled or left unrenewed. Instead, India increased purchases from other agricultural powerhouses like Brazil, Argentina, and Australia. The effect on American agriculture was devastating. Farmers who used to ship millions of bushels to India each year watched that market evaporate virtually overnight, erasing roughly $2 billion in annual export revenue. India's most quietly disruptive retaliation targeted the financial underpinnings of global trade. Being part of BRICS, India had been laying groundwork for financial systems outside U.S. control, and now it accelerated that effort dramatically. Indian banks and corporations began conducting more and more trade in currencies other than the dollar, settling payments in Indian rupees, Chinese yuan, Japanese yen, and so on yuan, or UAE dirhams, and embracing new international payment networks that bypass the US-dominated SWIFT system. As the trade war deepened, economists began tallying up the damage to the US economy. The projections were grim. The Penn-Wharton budget model estimated that Trump's steep tariffs, combined with the fallout from India's retaliation, would eventually shrink U.S. gross domestic product by around 8% and drive average American wages down by roughly 7%. Put in personal terms, a middle-income American family might lose on the order of $58,000 in lifetime earnings as a result of slower growth. One of the great ironies of this whole saga is just how much the United States had been benefiting from trade with India before it all fell apart. While President Trump frequently complained about a roughly $44 billion annual trade deficit with India, focusing only on goods, he ignored the bigger picture when services, investments, and royalties are included. Studies show that America actually ran a substantial surplus on the order of $35 to $40 billion a year in its overall economic relationship with India. The global fallout from the US-India rift has been just as alarming. Allies and adversaries alike are now rethinking their trade strategies in a world where the United States might suddenly upend relationships on a political whim. America's reputation as a reliable trading partner has taken a severe hit. Countries in Europe, Asia, and Africa are watching this unfold and asking themselves whether they could be next on Washington's tariff hit list. Indeed, one direct outcome of this conflict has been a boost to international groupings that exclude the United States. The BRICS alliance, which India is a part of, has gained newfound energy. Several emerging economies that have felt bullied by Western financial dominance are now eager to join BRICS, or deepen ties with its members as a counterweight to the US. This shift marks a potential turning point in global economics. A multipolar trading system where nations have alternatives to the US-centered order. Back in the United States, the trade war has laid bare a serious vulnerability: America's dependence on foreign sources for critical goods. The drug shortages triggered by India's export restrictions are a stark example. Americans are now painfully aware that a huge share of their medicines or the ingredients in those medicines come from overseas, especially from India and China. In response, federal authorities have initiated emergency measures to boost domestic production of pharmaceuticals and other essential supplies. But even with unlimited funding, none of that can be achieved overnight. creating a self-sufficient pharmaceutical supply chain could take years, if not decades. In the meantime, the health sector remains at the mercy of global supply lines, and any further escalation with foreign suppliers could put lives at risk.